A farmer's daughter went after a runaway pig, but in the cave she found something that changed everything. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments where you are watching from. The sun had not yet risen above the distant tree line when Aaliyah Harper awoke to the faint creak of the farmhouse settling in the early dawn chill. The air inside was cool and still, filled with the lingering scent of last night's wood smoke and the faint bitterness of old coffee grounds left on the stove. Outside, the world was draped in that soft, bluish light that came just before daybreak, when even the smallest sounds seemed sharper, clearer. The rustle of dry grass against the siding, the distant groan of the barn door as it swayed in the wind. She lay there for a moment, staring at the water-stained ceiling, her mind weighed down by the familiar ache of worry that had been gnawing at her family for months. Downstairs, she could hear her father moving around, his heavy boots thudding against the warped floorboards. Marcus Harper had been up for hours already, she was sure, because he always was. He rarely slept through the night anymore. Aaliyah rose reluctantly, pulling on her worn jeans and a faded hoodie that smelled faintly of hay. When she came down, her father was sitting at the small kitchen table, a stack of unopened envelopes beside him, his expression grim as he thumbed through them. He looked older than his 48 years. The lines around his eyes deepened from stress and sun, his hands calloused and cracked from decades of labor. One envelope lay open in front of him, its contents spread across the table. A bank letter, stamped with bold red ink at the top. Final notice. Aaliyah hesitated in the doorway, reading the words upside down. The message was painfully clear. They were 2 months behind, and if they didn't catch up, they would lose the farm. Her father looked up, his eyes tired but steady. "Mornin'," he said quietly, his voice rough from disuse. "Mornin'," she replied, trying to sound normal, but she felt the weight of his mood pressing down on her. Their farm was all they had, passed down from her grandparents, built with sweat and stubbornness on this stubborn stretch of land. It wasn't much, a handful of pigs, some chickens, 2 cows, and fields that barely grew enough hay to keep their animals fed. The soil here was rocky and dry, never forgiven, but it was theirs. Losing it was unthinkable. Marcus rose from the table and poured himself a fresh cup of coffee, muttering about the day's chores. "I've got to run to town, sell the eggs and milk," he said. "Might pick up feed if I can get it cheap." He glanced at her and added, "Watch the animals while I'm gone. No wandering off today." She nodded automatically, though her mind was elsewhere. He grabbed his truck keys and left with a tired sigh, the old screen door slamming shut behind him. Aaliyah stepped outside, the morning air biting against her cheeks. The world beyond their porch was still cloaked in mist, the fields pale and washed out, the hills that bordered their land barely visible through the haze. She walked toward the pens, boots crunching softly on the frost-hardened ground. The pigs were restless this morning, snuffling loudly, their snorts cutting through the silence. It was then she noticed it. One of the gates hung open, the latch bent slightly where it had been forced aside. Her stomach dropped. She counted quickly. 1 pig was missing. Pinky. Of course it was Pinky, the smallest but craftiest of the bunch, forever slipping through gaps and rooting in places she shouldn't be. "Damn it," Aaliyah muttered. They couldn't afford to lose even 1 pig. Each was worth money they desperately needed. She scanned the muddy ground and spotted a trail of small hoof prints leading away from the pen, across the yard, and towards the fence that bordered the woods. The fence line beyond their property had always been a boundary in more ways than one. Her father had warned her since childhood never to go past it. The hills beyond were dense and untamed, a tangle of woods and rocky outcroppings. He said it was too dangerous for her alone. Steep ravines, snakes, wild animals. But today, with Pinky on the loose and their survival hanging by a thread, Aaliyah didn't hesitate. She grabbed a length of rope, pulled her hoodie tighter around her, and followed the tracks. The prints were fresh, pressed deep into the damp earth, easy to follow even as they veered towards the thick brush at the far edge of their land. As she climbed over the fence, the world seemed to change. The air grew cooler beneath the canopy of trees, the light dimmer, the sounds sharper. Her boots squelched softly in the wet ground as she pushed deeper into the woods, following Pinky's trail. Minutes stretched into nearly half an hour as she tracked the pig further than she had ever ventured. The terrain shifted quickly from sparse woodland to steep, rocky slopes. Brambles tore at her jeans, snagged on her sleeves. The silence was uncanny. No bird song, just the sound of her breath and the occasional rustle of something unseen moving far off in the undergrowth. Finally, she heard it. A faint, familiar grunt that made her heart leap. "Pinky." She quickened her pace, stumbling over loose stones until she reached a narrow clearing hemmed in by jagged rocks. The sound came again, echoing strangely among them, and then she saw her. The pig stood at the mouth of what looked like a shallow cave, her snout pressed to the ground as if sniffing at something inside. Aaliyah slowed, her pulse hammering. She approached cautiously, stepping closer until she could peer into the darkness. And there, half hidden in shadow, she saw him. A man lay sprawled on the ground, his back against the cave wall. He was pale, his face slick with sweat, and his shirt was torn and soaked with dried blood along one shoulder. His chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven breaths. Beside him sat a weather-beaten backpack, its zipper partially open, papers spilling out onto the dirt floor. Aaliyah froze. She stared, unable to move. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to get back to the safety of home, to fetch her father. But something held her there, a mixture of shock, fear, and strange curiosity. Pinky snorted softly and wandered closer to the man, utterly unafraid. She edged forward, one cautious step, glancing around the clearing. That was when she noticed them. Boot prints. Several of them, larger than hers, stamped deep into the damp earth outside the cave. And tire tracks, too, faint but visible in the mud where the trail widened further back. Someone had been here recently. Her throat tightened. This wasn't just some random hiker or hunter. Whoever this man was, he didn't belong here. And yet, he was barely alive. Her gaze dropped to the backpack. From where she stood, she could see a rugged tablet half hidden beneath the spilled papers and something else, a small flash drive glinting faintly in the dim light. For a long moment, Aaliyah stood there, torn. Then, as if moving on instinct, she crept closer, crouched low, and reached for the tablet. The man stirred faintly, but didn't wake. His lips moved soundlessly, breath rasping, and his fingers twitched weakly toward the pack. Aaliyah snatched the tablet and backed away, her heart pounding so hard it hurt. She shoved it under her arm and turned, calling softly to Pinky. The pig followed obediently, grunting. She cast one last glance at the figure slumped in the cave, then fled back into the trees. By the time she reached the farmhouse again, the mist had burned away and the sun was high enough to cast sharp light across the fields. She was shaking, breathless, her hands clammy around the tablet. Pinky trotted happily into her pen as if nothing had happened. Aaliyah shut herself in her room and powered on the device. It flickered to life instantly, no password required. The home screen was filled with folders, each labeled with short, clinical names. Pipeline routes, acquisition contracts, confidential memos. Her pulse quickened as she opened the first file. What she saw made her stomach twist. Maps of their valley, thick lines tracing across it in bold red. Documents listing property sales, names of their neighbors, amounts so pitifully low she felt sick. Then another file. Emails. Words like eminent domain and lowball offers jumped out at her, along with mentions of displacing stubborn holdouts. She scrolled further, her breath coming faster. One message in particular caught her eye. It bore today's date. The engineer is missing. He has the files. Retrieve them by any means necessary. She stared at it, frozen. In the distance, an engine roared, her father's truck pulling into the yard. The noise jolted her back to herself. She slammed the tablet shut and shoved it under her bed. Her father's boots thudded on the porch. Aaliyah glanced toward the woods, her heart still hammering. Whatever she had stumbled upon in that cave, it was bigger than anything she had ever imagined. And she had the sinking feeling it was only the beginning. The sound of her father's boots on the porch felt louder than usual, each step echoing in Aaliyah's mind as she shoved the tablet farther beneath her bed. She forced herself to take a deep breath and straighten her posture, trying to look as if nothing were out of place. Marcus Harper came through the door, his shoulders hunched from a long morning at the market, his cap pulled low to shield his eyes from the sun that now poured through the windows. He carried 2 sacks, setting them down with a heavy sigh, and immediately glanced around as if taking stock of his home. Aaliyah's heart pounded, but she kept her face neutral. "Pinky, back in her pen?" he asked, his voice rough but casual. "Yes, sir," she replied, hoping her tone sounded steady. He nodded and busied himself with unpacking supplies. Cheap feed, a few tins of beans, a bag of flour. There was nothing extra, nothing unnecessary. Every purchase was carefully calculated. He didn't notice her stiff posture or the way she clutched the hem of her hoodie to hide her trembling hands. Aaliyah excused herself quickly, claiming she needed to check the chickens, and slipped outside to catch her breath. The late morning air was warmer now, carrying the earthy scent of tilled soil and distant wood smoke from neighboring farms. She walked towards the coop, but her mind wasn't on the hens. All she could think about was the tablet hidden under her bed, its contents flashing through her mind. Maps, contracts, and that ominous email warning about a missing engineer who needed to be retrieved by any means necessary. Her gaze drifted towards the distant line of trees beyond the back pasture, the same woods she had braved that morning. The image of the man lying in the cave was burned into her memory. His pale face, the dark blood staining his shirt, the weak rise and fall of his chest. Who was he really? Why was he hiding out there, hurt and alone? And what exactly had he done to make powerful people want him silenced? By midday, she couldn't stand it any longer. While her father rested after lunch, Aaliyah slipped back into the house and retrieved the tablet. She locked herself in her room, closed the curtains, and powered it on again. This time, she dug deeper, opening file after file, scrolling through pages of dense legal language and technical schematics. She didn't understand all of it, but certain things were clear. There was a plan to build a massive pipeline through their valley, and the company behind it had already started acquiring land. They were buying it cheap, pressuring struggling families with quiet threats and low offers that sounded generous enough to those desperate to escape debt. One folder contained a spreadsheet listing recent purchases. She recognized almost every name. The Millers, the Dawsons, the Crawfords, all neighbors, all families who had lived here for generations. Most had sold their land for barely enough to cover their loans and relocate. And next to her own family's name, there was an entry marked pending. Her stomach twisted. She opened another document, a scanned deed with her father's signature at the bottom. But she knew instantly it was fake. The handwriting was clumsy, uneven. Marcus Harper's signature was strong and deliberate, something he'd made her practice when she was younger for school forms. This one was a forgery. Aaliyah stared at it, her hands shaking. If they could forge a signature, what was stopping them from filing it legally and claiming their land was already sold? A faint rumble outside made her jump. She hurried to the window and saw a black pickup truck rolling slowly down the road past their property. Its windows were tinted so dark she couldn't see the driver. The truck didn't stop, but it moved deliberately slow, as if surveying the farmhouse. After a long moment, it accelerated and disappeared around the bend. Her pulse quickened. She hurried back to the tablet and opened the email folder again. There were threads of conversation between company executives and names she didn't recognize. Phrases leapt off the screen. Eminent domain approval. Push through resistance. Contain local dissent. It was clear these weren't just routine business dealings. They were prepared to crush anyone who stood in their way. When her father called her for supper, she hid the tablet again and forced herself to eat, though every bite felt like sand in her mouth. Marcus spoke little, his mind elsewhere, no doubt worrying about the farm and the bank's letter. Afterward, he settled into his worn armchair by the window, staring out at the dusky fields while nursing a cup of coffee. As night fell, Aaliyah lay awake in her bed, staring at the ceiling and listening to the sounds of the farmhouse settling. The wind sighed against the walls. An owl hooted in the distance. Sleep wouldn't come. Instead, she saw the man in the cave, his face pale and drawn, the blood on his shoulder stark against the dirt. He had looked like he was on the edge of death. If she did nothing, he would die. Before dawn, she rose quietly, dressed in silence, and packed a small bundle, a water bottle, a loaf of bread, some fruit, and the old first aid kit from under the sink. She slipped out while her father still slept, the world outside cloaked in blue-gray mist just like the morning before. She crossed the pasture and climbed the fence, her boots sinking into damp grass. The woods seemed even darker this time, but she pressed forward, following the path she had taken before. The silence of the forest was unnerving. No birds sang, no squirrels darted through the trees. It was as if the entire world held its breath. When she reached the rocky clearing, Pinky was there again, snuffling around the cave entrance as if she had claimed it for herself. The man inside hadn't moved much, but he was alive. His eyes fluttered open when she approached, unfocused at first, then fixing on her with faint recognition. She knelt beside him, heart hammering. Up close, his condition looked worse. His lips cracked, skin clammy, breathing shallow. His shoulder wound was crusted with dried blood, the shirt around it stiff and torn. She unscrewed the water bottle and tipped it toward his mouth. He drank greedily, coughing after each swallow, but he managed to get it down. "Here," she murmured, tearing off pieces of bread and feeding them to him slowly. He chewed weakly, barely able to lift his hands. When she cleaned his wound with trembling hands, he winced but didn't resist. She wrapped it tightly with a bandage from the kit. As she worked, she noticed the badge clipped to his torn shirt. Ethan Cross, Senior Engineer, Valeris Energy, Valeris Energy. The name matched what she'd seen on the tablet. Ethan watched her silently, his eyes glassy but sharp enough to track her movements. He seemed to want to speak, his lips parting slightly, but no words came. Finally, after several strained moments, he managed to whisper, "They Can't find me." His voice was hoarse, barely audible. "The files, don't let them." His strength gave out, and he slumped against the cave wall, breathing shallowly. Aaliyah stared at him, her mind racing. She glanced towards the mouth of the cave and caught sight of those boot prints again, clearer now in the morning light. They were fresh. Someone else had been here since yesterday. Her heart clenched. She looked back at Ethan, at the half-conscious man who somehow held evidence powerful enough to make people hunt him like this. Whatever danger she'd stumbled into, it was closing in fast, and whether she liked it or not, she was already part of it. When she slipped back home later that morning, she felt different. Edgy, alert, as though every creak of the floor or shadow outside might be a threat. She fed Pinky, scrubbed her hands clean, and hid her bundle of medical supplies in the barn loft, far from where her father might see it. By afternoon, 2 strangers in suits were seen at the edge of town, asking questions about trespassers in the area. Neighbors whispered about men in dark trucks patrolling the back roads at night. And that evening, while Aaliyah helped her father mend a fence, a black pickup slowed as it passed their property again. This time, it didn't even pretend not to be watching. The danger was no longer distant. It was right outside their door. The uneasy quiet that had settled over the Harper farm after that second morning never left. It hung in the air like a storm waiting to break, thick and oppressive. Aaliyah felt it in the way her father glanced toward the road more often than usual, his brow furrowed as though expecting something to come rolling up the dirt path. It was in the way the neighbors spoke in hushed voices when they visited, looking over their shoulders as though afraid someone might be listening. And it was in the trucks, those black pickups with tinted windows that prowled the roads at odd hours, engines low and steady, always seeming to slow near their property before disappearing down the bend. Aaliyah tried to go through her days as if nothing were different, but everything had changed. Every chore felt mechanical, her body moving while her mind spun elsewhere. Each time she scattered feed for the chickens or hauled water to the troughs, her thoughts circled back to the man in the cave. Ethan Cross. His name felt foreign in her mouth, but it was etched in her memory now. He was alive, barely, and he was relying on her. She had been back to see him twice more since that morning, each time stealing moments when her father was busy or away in town. She brought food, bread, cheese, apples from the small orchard, water, and more bandages to replace the ones she had used. Each visit left her stomach knotted tighter. He was recovering, but slowly, too slowly, his body battered from whatever he'd endured. And though he still spoke little, each time she went, she saw more awareness in his eyes, as if he were surfacing from deep water and struggling to breathe again. The last time, he had rasped out a single phrase between shallow breaths. "They're coming closer." That night, Aaliyah lay awake long after her father's snores had settled into their steady rhythm. She stared at the ceiling in the dark, heart pounding, her mind replaying those words. She didn't know who they were, but she didn't need to. She could feel their presence already. By morning, her fears were confirmed. She heard it first from Mrs. Wheeler, an elderly widow who ran the small post office in town. Aaliyah had accompanied her father to pick up supplies, and as she lingered by the doorway, Mrs. Wheeler leaned across the counter and whispered to her father that 2 men in suits had been by earlier, flashing badges from some private security firm. They were asking questions about strangers, about trespassers hiding out in the hills. They didn't say much else, Mrs. Wheeler added nervously, glancing around the room. But they gave me a feeling I didn't like. Slick smiles, polite enough voices, but cold eyes, like they weren't really here to ask, just to see who looked nervous when they asked. Marcus frowned deeply and muttered his thanks, his hand tightening on the paper bag of feed he carried. On the way home, he was quieter than usual, his jaw clenched, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. Aaliyah sat beside him in silence, fighting the urge to tell him everything right then. But she couldn't. Not yet. Not when she wasn't sure who might already be watching them. That evening, as they finished dinner in tense quiet, the sound of tires crunching on gravel made Marcus stand abruptly from his chair. Aaliyah followed him to the front door. Out beyond the fence, on the narrow road that led past their farm, a black pickup truck idled slowly, its headlights cutting sharp beams through the dark. It lingered there for a long moment, engine rumbling, before finally easing forward and disappearing into the night. "They're watching," Marcus said grimly, though more to himself than to her. The following day brought even more signs. Mr. Lawson, who lived 2 properties over, came by mid-morning, his face pale and tight. He told Marcus that men from some company had stopped at his house, offering to buy his land for a price far higher than any farm around there would normally fetch. When he hesitated, they grew pushier, hinting about debts and legal complications if he refused. His wife had been terrified. "They're not just making offers," Lawson said. "They're making threats without saying the words." Marcus swore softly under his breath, then offered Lawson coffee and a place to sit. Aaliyah lingered nearby, listening intently, but no one noticed her. That night, she crept out again, driven by the same gnawing worry. The woods felt different now, tenser, more alive, as though unseen eyes tracked her every move. Branches snapped somewhere behind her once, making her whirl around, but nothing was there except shadows. When she finally reached the clearing, her relief at finding Ethan still alive nearly brought her to her knees. He was sitting upright now, his back braced against the wall of the cave. His color was better, though he was still gaunt and exhausted, a sheen of sweat on his forehead. When she knelt beside him and handed him water, his fingers brushed hers, cold and trembling. "They're close," he whispered hoarsely after drinking. "I heard them. Voices yesterday. 2 men, maybe 3. They're hunting me." Aaliyah felt her heart hammering in her chest. "Who?" she asked softly, though she already knew. "Company men," Ethan croaked, grimacing as he shifted. "Private contractors. Valeris doesn't use police. They hire these guys. They know the files are gone. They know I took them." He gestured weakly toward the leather pouch tucked beside him, the same one she'd seen before. "The flash drive," he added. "It's everything. Proof they forged signatures. Proof they paid off county officials to approve the pipeline without permits. If it gets out, they're finished. That's why they'll do anything to stop me." Aaliyah sat back, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. It was one thing to suspect danger, another to hear it confirmed. He coughed, grimacing in pain, then looked up at her. His eyes were sharp despite his weakness. "You need to be careful. They'll come to your father, to your neighbors. They'll smile, they'll pretend to help, but they're working for Valeris. Trust no one who comes asking questions." She swallowed hard and nodded. When she returned home, her father was waiting on the porch. His silhouette against the lantern light was rigid, his arms crossed. "Where have you been?" he asked. His tone wasn't angry, but suspicious. "I just needed some air," she replied quickly, and his gaze lingered on her for a long moment before he sighed and let it drop. But She could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he glanced past her towards the dark line of trees, as if he, too, sensed there was more going on than either of them was saying. Over the next 2 days, the sense of being watched only grew worse. Trucks passed by more often now. Once, Aaliyah spotted one parked just down the road, engine off, a man in the driver's seat watching their house. By the time she called for her father, it was gone. Another time, she overheard 2 men at the feed store whispering about a reward for anyone with information about a missing contractor from Valaris Energy. That night, as she sat in her room staring at the tablet once more, reading and rereading the files until her head ached, she realized the truth she had been avoiding. This was no longer about just Ethan or his files. This was about them too. Her father, their farm, and every family in the valley. If Valaris got what it wanted, they would all be driven out, their homes bulldozed, their land swallowed by steel and concrete. And yet, as fear gnawed at her, another feeling began to take root: resolve. She couldn't keep hiding from this. She couldn't just hope it would go away. Not anymore. By the time dawn crept over the hills the next morning, Aaliyah Harper had made up her mind. She would not only keep helping Ethan, she would learn everything she could about what Valaris was planning. And when the moment came, she would be ready to act, no matter the risk. That decision carried her through the day, even as another black pickup rolled slowly past their house, and even as her father muttered darkly about strangers asking questions down at the gas station. Something was building now, like thunder on the horizon. A storm was coming, and whether she liked it or not, she and her father were standing directly in its path. The next evening came heavy with the weight of unease that had been building for days. The dusk settled low over the farm, draping everything in a muted, bruised light, as if the sun itself was reluctant to shine. Aaliyah sat at the table opposite her father, pushing food around her plate more than she ate it, her mind restless, listening for the slightest sound from outside. Marcus barely spoke either, his shoulders taut, his eyes flicking toward the window every few minutes. The silence between them was no longer just quiet. It was charged, full of unspoken things neither dared bring forward. After dinner, Marcus rose to check the locks on the doors, a habit he'd picked up in recent days. Aaliyah noticed the way his gaze swept across the yard, pausing on every shadow, every stretch of fence, before he shut the curtains and drew the deadbolt with a decisive click. When he turned back to her, his expression was set and grim. "I don't like what's been happening out here," he said finally, his voice low. "Too many trucks on the road at night. Too many strangers asking questions that don't concern them." Aaliyah swallowed hard. "What kind of questions?" "About trespassers," Marcus said. "About people hiding in the hills. About whether I'd seen anyone I shouldn't have." His gaze pinned her. "And they're not asking like they expect me to say no." She felt her stomach knot tighter. Before she could reply, the sound of tires on gravel cut through the quiet. Marcus stiffened immediately. He strode to the window, pulling back the curtain just enough to look out. "Truck," he muttered. "Same black pickup as before." Aaliyah joined him and peered out. Sure enough, the vehicle sat idling just beyond their gate, headlights off, its dark silhouette hulking against the fading light. It didn't move. Marcus's jaw tightened. He grabbed his old hunting rifle from its rack by the door and checked the chamber. "Stay inside," he said sharply, stepping onto the porch. But Aaliyah couldn't. She followed him out into the chill evening air, heart thudding as he strode down the path toward the gate. The truck door opened and 2 men climbed out, both tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in casual clothes that did nothing to soften their intimidating presence. One wore a baseball cap pulled low, the other a jacket that bulged at the hip in a way that suggested a weapon. "Evening, Mr. Harper," the man in the cap called smoothly, as if this were nothing more than a friendly visit. His tone was almost pleasant, but his eyes were flat and cold. Marcus didn't lower the rifle. "You've been circling my land for days," he said. "State your business." "We're just looking for someone," the man said, smiling faintly. "A contractor who went missing from Valaris Energy. Dangerous fellow. We think he might be hiding out around these parts. You haven't seen anyone suspicious, have you?" Marcus's grip tightened. "I haven't seen a damn thing. And you've got no business prowling around here after dark. You can leave now." The second man stepped closer, his gaze sliding toward Aaliyah. "You sure about that? This fella's hurt, might come knocking at your door asking for help. Good folks like you wouldn't turn away a man like that, would you?" "I said leave," Marcus repeated, his voice sharp as the rifle's muzzle lifted slightly. The man in the cap raised his hands in mock surrender, though his smirk didn't falter. "All right. No need to get jumpy. We'll be around, though. If you see anything at all, you let us know. Wouldn't want any trouble finding its way here." He tipped his cap, then turned back toward the truck. They climbed in, the engine rumbling to life, and slowly rolled away down the dirt road, taillights vanishing into the dark. Marcus stayed standing there long after they'd gone, the rifle still held ready. Aaliyah could see the tension in his stance, the way his shoulders didn't ease even after silence reclaimed the night. When he finally lowered the gun and turned back toward the house, his eyes found hers, sharp and searching. "What aren't you telling me, Aaliyah?" She froze. Inside, he set the rifle back in its place and turned to face her fully. "I've known you 17 years. I know when you're hiding something. You've been restless, slipping off at odd hours. And now men with guns are circling our farm, looking for someone who sounds an awful lot like the kind of person you'd risk helping." Her mouth went dry. She wanted to deny it, but the words stuck in her throat. She saw the worry etched deep in his face, the way his hands curled into fists at his sides. This wasn't just suspicion, it was fear. She drew a breath, steadying herself. "There's a man in the hills," she admitted finally, her voice trembling despite her effort to keep it firm. Marcus's eyes narrowed, but he didn't interrupt. "I found him 2 mornings ago when Pinky ran off. He's hurt bad, Dad. I couldn't just leave him there." Marcus's face darkened, his jaw clenching. "Are you out of your mind, girl? You don't know who he is, what he's done." "I do know," she interrupted, surprising herself with her own force. "His name's Ethan Cross. He worked for Valaris. He has proof, documents, files, that they're stealing land from people out here. Forged signatures, bribes. They're planning to take everything, Dad. Everything." Marcus stared at her, stunned into silence. She pressed on, the words spilling out now, months of pent-up fear and the urgency of what she'd seen. She told him about the tablet, the emails, the forged deed with his name on it, about Ethan's warnings and the trucks that prowled the roads at night. By the time she finished, Marcus had sunk into his chair, his face pale, one hand pressed against his forehead as though steadying himself against a spinning world. "They forged my name," he murmured. "Yes," she said quietly. "They're doing it to others, too. The Millers, the Dawsons, all those folks who sold cheap. They didn't know their land was worth 10 times that to the company. And now they're coming for us." Marcus lifted his gaze to hers, and in it she saw not anger but grim understanding. His expression hardened in that way she'd seen only a few times before, in moments of true resolve. "Take me to him," he said. It was near midnight when they slipped from the house, their boots crunching softly in the cold dirt. Marcus carried the rifle slung across his shoulder, his other hand gripping a flashlight. They crossed the pasture, climbed the fence, and entered the woods, the darkness thick around them, broken only by the beam of light cutting ahead. When they reached the clearing, Ethan stirred weakly at their approach. His eyes opened, wary but softened when they settled on Aaliyah. Marcus knelt beside him, setting down the flashlight. For a long moment, father and stranger studied each other in silence, the air between them taut with unspoken questions. Marcus broke it first. "You've got proof of what they're doing?" Ethan nodded faintly and reached toward the pouch beside him. His hand trembled as he passed it over. Marcus opened it, flipping through papers by flashlight. Maps, deeds, internal memos stamped confidential. His eyes narrowed at what he saw. "They're planning to run the pipeline straight through the valley," Ethan rasped. "Bought up land for pennies, forged signatures for the rest. County officials got paid to look the other way. It's all in there." Marcus looked up, his expression grim. "And those men, tonight?" "Valeris Security," Ethan said hoarsely. "They'll do anything to keep this buried." Marcus closed the pouch slowly, his grip tightening around it. He exhaled hard, steadying himself. "All right," he said. "If they think they can take this valley without a fight, they're wrong." Aaliyah glanced between them, her heart hammering. In that moment, she knew everything had shifted. The quiet dread that had hung over their farm was gone, replaced by something sharper, harder. Her father wasn't just aware now, he was ready to act. When they returned home, the first pale streaks of dawn were bleeding across the horizon. Marcus set the pouch on the table and spread its contents out in full view. "We're going to show this to the others," he said, his voice steady. "The Lawsons, the Crawfords, every family they've swindled. If we stand together, Valeris won't stand a chance." Aaliyah looked at him, a surge of fierce pride swelling in her chest. For the first time in days, she felt something stronger than fear. She felt hope and determination that no matter what came next, they would not face it alone. The first morning after Marcus had seen the documents dawned clear and cold, the kind of stillness that made every sound carry sharply across the valley. Aaliyah stood on the porch with her arms wrapped around herself, watching her father stride across the yard toward the barn with the determined gait of a man who had settled something heavy in his mind. He had barely slept. She could hear him pacing half the night, reading and rereading the files Ethan had given them by the weak light of the kitchen lantern. When he had finally spoken, it had been with a clarity that left no room for doubt. They were going to fight back. The kitchen table was still covered in the evidence. Maps sprawled edge to edge, marked with red lines tracing the proposed pipeline route through their valley and across dozens of properties. Stacks of documents bore forged signatures, names she knew well, belonging to neighbors who would be devastated to see how cheaply their land had been stolen. There were emails referencing payoffs to local officials and orders to rush land acquisitions before public hearings could bring attention. Marcus had studied every page, his jaw tightening, his rough hands gripping the papers until they creased. By mid-morning, he had hitched their old pickup and was driving out across the valley, stopping at familiar farmhouses along dirt roads that wound through the rolling hills. Aaliyah went with him, the pouch of papers clutched tightly in her lap. At the first stop, they sat across from Tom and Mary Lawson at their worn kitchen table, steam rising from mugs of coffee that went untouched. Marcus spread the papers between them and spoke plainly. "They forged my name too," he said, sliding the falsified deed across. "We're not selling out. Neither should you. And if we stand together, we can stop them." The Lawsons exchanged glances, their faces paling as they read through the proof. Tom Lawson swore under his breath and shook his head. "I knew something was off when those men came by. I just didn't think they'd stoop this low." Word spread quickly. By the end of the day, they had visited 4 more farms. Each reaction was nearly the same: disbelief, anger, fear given way to a fierce resolve. Some of the neighbors had already sold their land for a fraction of its value, but Marcus promised them they could fight to reclaim what was rightfully theirs. Those who hadn't signed yet vowed not to. By the second day, whispers turned into meetings. Marcus gathered a group of 12 families in the Harper's barn after dark, away from prying eyes and wandering headlights. Lanterns cast a warm glow over weathered faces as they pored over the documents together. These were people who had spent their lives in this valley, working its stubborn soil, raising their children here. Now, sitting shoulder to shoulder, they shared stories of strange visits from men and trucks, sudden offers that felt more like ultimatums, and veiled threats about foreclosure and debts. "This isn't just a land grab," said Mr. Carter from down the road, his voice sharp. "This is theft, plain and simple. They're counting on us being too scared or too broke to fight back," Marcus said, "but they don't know us." The room murmured in agreement. Plans formed. They would make copies of the documents and spread them wider. They would contact families even farther out who hadn't heard what was happening. And most importantly, they would prepare to take this beyond the valley, to lawyers, journalists, anyone who could shine a light on what Valeris was doing. But danger pressed closer with each passing day. The black trucks became a constant presence, prowling the back roads, sometimes parking just out of sight of the farms as if their drivers wanted to be seen. One evening, Aaliyah spotted one idling at the edge of their property. It lingered until Marcus emerged from the house with his rifle slung over his shoulder, and only then did it pull away slowly, its taillights glowing like twin embers in the night. Rumors swirled in town. Some said the sheriff had been seen talking privately with company men. Others claimed that Valeris was preparing to invoke eminent domain to seize any landowners who refused their offers. Even the feed store clerk lowered his voice when he spoke of it, his eyes darting nervously to the door. Aaliyah felt the tension creeping under her skin more each day. At night, she still slipped away to bring supplies to Ethan, who remained hidden in the cave. He was stronger now, though pale and worn, his shoulder bandaged and healing under her care. Each time she visited, he asked for news of the valley, and she told him of the meetings, of the neighbors who were joining their cause. His tired smile gave her courage. "That's how you beat them," he said one night, his voice steadier. "Not alone. Together." But Valeris was watching too closely for comfort. Late one afternoon, as Marcus was mending a section of fence, a sheriff's cruiser pulled up the drive. Sheriff Harlan stepped out, hat in hand, his expression carefully neutral. "Evening, Marcus," he said, his drawl slow and even. "Heard some talk about strangers in the hills. Folks are saying you've seen things." Marcus wiped his hands on a rag and stared back coolly. "I've seen your cruiser parked outside Wheeler's store more often than it needs to be," he said flatly. "And I've seen black trucks prowling roads where they don't belong." Harlan smiled thinly. "A lot of nervous folks out there. Don't want anyone doing something foolish." His gaze slid past Marcus toward the house, toward Aaliyah standing in the doorway, and lingered a second too long before he tipped his hat and left. That night, Marcus doubled their precautions. He barred the doors, checked the locks twice, and told Aaliyah not to go out alone. He stayed up late, seated at the kitchen table with his rifle within reach, watching the road through the window. The air felt thick with expectation, as if the valley itself held its breath. Despite the danger, their organizing continued. Marcus worked with Ethan to draft a statement that laid out the evidence plainly, along with copies of the most damning documents. The plan was to deliver them to a local journalist known for his independence, a man who had once tangled with county officials over corruption and come out swinging. Meanwhile, the other farmers agreed to keep eyes on the roads and report every truck, every stranger. The turning point came when one of the Crawfords arrived breathless at their door just after dawn, clutching a crumpled notice from the bank. It claimed their loan was being called early, demanding full repayment in 30 days or foreclosure would begin. "We've never missed a payment," Mrs. Crawford said, her hands trembling. "This is them. They're trying to scare us out." Marcus's expression hardened. "Then it's time to stop waiting for them to come to us." By the week's end, preparations were in full swing. Copies of Ethan's files were hidden in barns, under floorboards, even tucked into feed sacks, distributed so widely that taking them all would be impossible. The farmers agreed to gather again in 2 days, this time with more families invited, and if Valeris dared to act openly, they would be ready to meet them with a united front. That evening, as lanterns flickered in the barn during another secret meeting, Aaliyah looked around at the familiar faces hardened by resolve. Fear still lingered in the room, but it was tempered by something stronger now: anger, solidarity, and the unspoken understanding that they were fighting not just for their land, but for their way of life. When the meeting ended and the farmers filed out into the chill night, Aaliyah lingered behind, staring at the papers spread across the table once more. Ethan's words echoed in her mind. Together. She clenched her fists, feeling the truth of it settle deep in her bones. Outside, the headlights of a truck flared briefly on the horizon before vanishing into the dark. Somewhere out there, Valeris was watching, waiting, tightening its grip. But for the first time, Aaliyah didn't feel like prey. They were ready, and soon the company would find out exactly what it meant to push too far. The night before everything came to a head was colder than any Aaliyah could remember that season. The chill seeped into the farmhouse walls, crept along the wooden floors, and settled deep in her bones no matter how tightly she wrapped herself in her quilt. She lay awake, staring at the faint shadows cast on the ceiling, listening to the restless sighs of the wind outside and the occasional groan of old timbers under strain. Below her room, she could hear her father's heavy footsteps as he paced, moving from window to window as he had done every night for the past week. The loaded rifle rested permanently on the kitchen table now, alongside the neatly stacked papers and flash drives that had become the heart of their resistance. Valeris had made its move earlier that day. The Crawfords had returned home to find a construction notice staked into their yard, declaring their property condemned for public development and citing eminent domain. By nightfall, 3 other families had found the same notices posted on their fences. The company's trucks were no longer content to lurk at the edges of the valley. Now they drove openly, roaring down the narrow roads in convoys, their headlights glaring into windows, leaving tire tracks like scars in the dirt. Aaliyah's father had said little as the sun went down, but the determination in his face was unmistakable. He sat at the table, poring over maps with Ethan's guidance. The injured man was still pale and weak, but he had managed to come to the farmhouse under cover of darkness 2 nights earlier. Too vulnerable to remain hidden in the cave any longer, he rested now in the spare room, his shoulder bound tight, his voice hoarse but steady as he relayed every detail of what Valeris planned and how their files could dismantle it all. Aaliyah hovered in the doorway, watching as her father straightened up, rubbing a hand over his stubbled jaw. "Tomorrow," he said finally, looking at Ethan and then at her, "we take this to the city. If we can get these papers in the right hands before Valeris knows we're gone, they won't be able to bury it." The plan was simple but dangerous. They would load Ethan and the evidence into the truck before dawn, drive the back roads to avoid being spotted, and deliver everything to a journalist in the city who had agreed to meet them. Meanwhile, the other farmers would stage a blockade at the valley's entrance, slowing any company vehicles or deputies who might be sent to interfere. Sleep came only in fragments that night, broken by half-heard noises outside, the low rumble of an engine somewhere in the distance, or the sharp bark of the neighbor's dog. Each sound made Aaliyah's heart pound faster until she lay awake again, staring at the dark ceiling, fists clenched tight beneath the covers. By the time the first pale light of dawn crept across the hills, she was dressed and ready, her hands trembling slightly as she laced her boots. Downstairs, her father was already moving, his face set with grim focus as he packed supplies into the back of the truck. Food, blankets, a jerry can of fuel, and a battered lockbox containing every copy of Ethan's files they had prepared. Ethan himself shuffled slowly out of the spare room, his movements stiff but determined. As Marcus helped him into the truck's cab, Aaliyah glanced toward the horizon. Across the valley floor, the silhouettes of other trucks and farmhands were gathering, headlights blinking on like fireflies in the dimness. The blockade was forming just as planned, a wall of battered farm vehicles and tractors ready to hold the road if Valeris came too soon. It gave her a fierce sense of pride, seeing those neighbors who had once only shared nods at the feed store now standing shoulder to shoulder against something much larger than themselves. They were less than 5 miles from home when Aaliyah saw the first black truck. It came barreling around a bend in the road ahead, its engine roaring, headlights cutting through the mist. Her father cursed under his breath, gripping the wheel tighter. "Hold on." He swung the truck off the paved road and onto a narrow dirt track that cut across the fields, tires spitting mud. Another engine roared behind them. Aaliyah twisted in her seat and saw it. A second black pickup, closer now, its grille looming in the rearview mirror. For a moment, she was frozen, staring at the gleam of sunlight off its windshield. But then adrenaline jolted through her veins like fire. Marcus kept the truck steady despite the jostling bumps of the dirt road, his knuckles white on the wheel. Ethan groaned faintly in the back seat, his head pressed against the glass, pale but resolute. "Stay low," Marcus barked. The chase was relentless. The rear truck closed in until Aaliyah could make out the faint outline of a man behind the wheel, a grim silhouette framed by the glare of morning light. The first truck ahead veered sideways, attempting to block their path, but Marcus braked hard and swung the wheel, skidding into a narrow path between a stand of trees that barely cleared their mirrors. Branches slapped against the windows, but they pushed through, the truck bouncing over ruts. When they burst out onto the road again, they were ahead of the first truck, though the second still hounded their rear. Aaliyah's heart pounded in her throat. The city was still miles away. They cleared the valley edge just as the farmers' blockade came into view. A line of vehicles stretched across the main road, tractors and old pickups nose to nose, and behind them stood a crowd of men and women holding signs hastily painted the night before. Our land, our homes, valorous out. The air vibrated with the growl of engines and shouted voices. Marcus didn't slow. He swerved around the line of trucks and sped down the open lane the farmers had left for them, waving once through the open window. Behind them, the pursuing black pickup skidded to a halt, blocked by the wall of angry farmers who stepped forward to meet it. Aaliyah caught a glimpse in the mirror, men climbing from their trucks, shouting, before being surrounded by the growing crowd. The city felt like another world when they finally reached it, its wide streets and tall buildings alien after weeks spent hemmed in by the valley's hills. Marcus parked near the small brick office of the journalist who had agreed to meet them. His name was Victor Hale, a grizzled man with sharp eyes and a reputation for digging up truths that others wanted buried. He ushered them inside quickly, locking the door behind them. Within an hour, Hale had scanned every file, photographed every forged deed, recorded every word of Ethan's testimony. His phone rang constantly as he spoke to editors and contacts in a voice that grew sharper and more animated with each call. "They won't be able to contain this," he said finally, turning to Marcus and Aaliyah with a rare smile. "By tonight, this will be everywhere." And it was. By evening, the story dominated every local broadcast. Valaris Energy accused of land fraud and forgery, headlines blared. Images of the blockade in the valley spread across social media, video clips of farmers standing defiant against black trucks and men in suits, fueling a surge of public outrage. The fallout came swiftly. County officials scrambled to distance themselves from the scandal, and federal investigators arrived within days. Valaris executives were subpoenaed, their private contractors ordered to stand down. The forged deeds were declared invalid, and proceedings began to reclaim the stolen land. Compensation was promised for those coerced into selling. When Aaliyah returned home that night with her father and Ethan, the farmhouse felt lighter than it had in months. The valley was alive with the sound of honking horns and celebratory shouts from neighbors who gathered along the roads to wave and cheer as they passed. In the yard, Pinky rooted happily in her pen, oblivious to the part she had played in starting it all. Marcus stood on the porch, gazing out at the land that was theirs once more, his arm draped over Aaliyah's shoulders. Ethan sat nearby, still weak but smiling faintly. "You did it," he murmured. "No," Marcus said, his voice steady but warm. "We all did." Aaliyah breathed in the crisp night air, her heart swelling as she looked out over the moonlit fields, the familiar shapes of barns and fences, the distant glow of lanterns in neighboring windows. For the first time in what felt like forever, she felt safe. They had stood their ground, and they had won. And deep down, she knew this was only the beginning, not just for her family, but for everyone who called this valley home. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you never miss our next story. Click on the videos on your screen to keep watching more, and share this video with your friends to spread the word. Your support helps us bring more stories like this to life.